Aloha and welcome to 18.4. We are going to talk about the rise of Napoleon and his downfall. Just to review, we've talked about the fall of the French monarchy, the rise of the French revolutionary government, and we ended the story with the rise of the Directory time period, trying to create some stability in the society without having everything fall apart. Napoleon kind of grew up during this 10-year time period of the French Revolution, but his father worked in the French government and was able to get a scholarship for several of his children, and Napoleon was one of those. So Napoleon was packed off to military school at the tender age of 9. He was going to school with the children of the noblemen, and he was poor, so he had a very rough childhood. But he grew up, learned how to become a military officer, and he was taught how to use artillery. That was his specialty as an officer. So as things are happening in France, his life is characterized by extremely good luck. He's always in town when something important is happening, and he usually gets a commission to a battlefield where there is a lot of prestige to be won. One of his early battlefield arenas was northern Italy, and he wins a lot of battles in that time period and is recognized for his abilities. Also during this time period, there is a lot of looting going on because that's one of the ways that the military is getting their pay or their money to continue, is they're taking a lot of the wealth and the artwork that has accumulated. If you go to France today, the Louvre is full of Napoleon's pieces that he took during his warfare, the Revolutionary War. As they progress, England becomes one of the main combatants against France. Napoleon spent some time in Egypt, and while he is there, he uncovers several important things and actually starts a new field of history called archaeology. Because up until this point, of course, historians have known that there was an ancient civilization in Egypt. The writing, they were never able to decipher it. There was no systematic study of the Egyptian culture, the ancient Egyptian culture. But while Napoleon is there, several of his men are taking very valuable pieces of history, and they find a red slab of rock that has 3 types of writing on it. It has Egyptian hieroglyphics, it has Greek writing, and it has the intermediate stage they call hieratic, which is kind of like Egyptian cursive, short version of hieroglyphics. Napoleon confiscates this slab and brings it back to Paris, along with all of other loot that he has found. And it is recognized as being an important key to the deciphering of the ancient Egyptian script. Several scholars begin to study it, and they are able to create a crib sheet for the ancient hieroglyphics. And suddenly, a huge ancient civilization is revealed through this one discovery. Napoleon is credited to some extent with beginning the field of archaeology and starting to make archaeology a reputable profession rather than just grave robbing, which it had been up until this point. Napoleon in Egypt gets a request from the Directory to return to France because the Directory realizes that they need a military leader who will help to bring some stability and law and order to the chaos that has been happening in France. So he basically drops everything in Egypt and he returns very quickly to France. He does so before any of the news of his burning of the cities of Palestine or his destruction of all the stuff that's happening in Egypt. So he basically is able to control his image in the press. The Directory offers him a job that he can't refuse. He's given the job as one of 3 consuls that will help to rule France. And very quickly, his abilities as a leader outshine the other 2, and they kind of fade into the background, and he basically becomes the new ruler of France. During this time, he also meets his wife. Her name is Josephine. She had a kind of sketchy background, but he fell head over heels for her. And it's interesting. I don't think he was able to talk very easily to women. I think he was a little intimidated by them, and he also had a very low opinion of women. So during his time as the ruler of France, any gains they had during the French Revolution are going to be lost during Napoleon's reign. He and Josephine are married. They are going to be crowned as Emperor and Empress of France. But during this time, Napoleon and Josephine had a tempestuous relationship. They were often shouting and screaming at each other. Both of them were very high-strung individuals. So this is going to play out later in their as time goes on. Napoleon eventually decides that he needs to have an heir to his growing empire, and he decides that Josephine is never going to give him that heir, whether she could not medically or regardless of what the circumstances were, he decides to make a very calculated decision. He divorces Josephine and ends up marrying an Austrian royal princess. She does give him an heir, but that child does not survive. That was his only child, and he did not survive. Napoleon sets out right away to start bringing some law and order and structure to France. France had a ruined economy, so he starts to put some very strict rules in place to try to control the inflation that was happening, controlling the prices that were rising exponentially, reduced taxation. He did a lot of things that at least stabilized the economy to some extent. He consolidated a lot of the power. He created a centralized government, a centralized law system, which he named very typically the Napoleonic Law Code. And this law code is actually pretty good. It was based on the Enlightenment ideas of equality. A lot of those laws are still in place in different European countries today. So you can tell that it was well made. He set about creating a better infrastructure for France. He did this by building roads and bridges, and a lot of the work was done by something called the levée, which is where people are basically conscripted, men are conscripted to do labor for the government as part of their taxation. Instead of paying taxes, they would do work. Actually, the French agreed to this. They thought that this was an appropriate thing. During this time, Napoleon had this idea that Europe needed to be one empire under his rule. From 1804 until 1812, Napoleon is at war with the other European nations, and slowly but surely he basically overwhelms Europe and makes it into a French empire. During this time, every nation that falls under his control, he replaces the royal monarchy with members of his own family. Napoleon also had the brilliant idea, he needed money very badly, so he decided that he would offer Louisiana to the Americans in order to get some money for his campaign in Europe. And he believed that eventually, after he was successful in Europe, he would have more time to go and reconquer that land. Probably, we're guessing. We don't really know what he was thinking, but it's possible that he was thinking of reconquering that land and the rest of North America when he had the time. He sells Louisiana to the Americans. Then he uses that money to fight and overtake the Netherlands and Belgium and Italy, parts of Germany, and all this territory gets combined into one continental empire. The only place that really avoids being conquered is England. That's mainly because England has such a good navy at this time. They have the best navy in the world. They are also the most industrialized at this point. No other place in Europe has any kind of industrial capacity. I mean, they are starting to industrialize, but England is far more advanced industrially than the rest of Europe. Napoleon wants to somehow starve England into submission. So he decides that he is going to stop allowing trade between England and the rest of Europe. And he calls this the continental system. The problem is that England can survive much better without the rest of Europe than the rest of Europe can survive without England. So Europe starts to feel very stifled by these laws that Napoleon has put in place. And the least industrialized country of Europe is Russia, and they soon realize that they have to break this continental system. So the Tsar of Russia decides that he is going to start trading again with England. He breaks the continental system. And when Napoleon hears about this, he is furious. And he immediately starts amassing army, which he's going to call the Grande Armée. Now, by this point in time, they have worked their way through most of the population, the excess population of France. They have run out of young men to be in the French military. And so by this point, the Grande Armée is made up of other European countries, adventurers from around Europe. He amasses about 600,000 soldiers in all, and they start marching from France all the way to Russia. It takes several months to get there because this is quite a long distance. When they hit the border of Russia, the Tsar practices something that is absolutely brilliant. He basically uses the Russian topography to his advantage. Because Russia is so large and their winters are so cold, that is a weapon in itself. So the Tsar tells his military to clear out a huge swath where the French military is going to be marching, and they clear off every farmland. They kill every animal that cannot be moved. They burn every field. They burn down every homestead. They poison every well, kill as much of the wildlife, or they drive off the wildlife, so that when the French army gets there, there is nothing to eat. There is no shelter. In August, that's fine. But as the year progresses, it gets colder and darker. And eventually, Napoleon is marching to the capital of Russia at this point, which is Moscow. It gets to be September, October, November. They have been living on what they have scrounged, if they could find anything, which was rare, but they've also had their own supplies, and they're burning through their own supplies. They eventually get too far away from their own supply lines. They are stranded in the middle of nowhere. But they know that if they can get to Moscow, hopefully they'll be able to capture the city and be able to survive the winter. Napoleon did not think that the Tsar would actually destroy his own capital. But he was wrong. The Tsar, when he realized Napoleon was near, he cleared out the entire city and he set it on fire. When Napoleon showed up, it was still burning. Most of it there was at least half of it that was burnt to the ground, and the other half was burning in progress. And Napoleon quickly moves to put out the fire, but realizes that there really is not enough in the city to survive for the winter. If they don't start moving now, they will be there and they will all starve and freeze to death. So he has to make this very quick decision: stay and definitely die, or turn around and try to go back and possibly live. So he tries to march back, but most of his Grand Army dies on the way. Just to give some perspective, out of 600,000 soldiers, 20,000 soldiers get back. That is an enormous amount of soldiers to lose. And when he gets back to Paris, he realizes that the rest of the European countries have used that moment or that opportunity, and they have all created or reassembled their own militaries, and they are marching towards France again. He sends out another call, another draft, and he's able to amass another army. He meets the Continental Army, or all of the different European armies that have combined into one big force in Belgium in the Battle of Nations, and they have a huge battle in which Napoleon, using these very unskilled troops that he has managed to scrape together, he is losing and he's going to fail. But instead of running away, he gets captured on the field and he is forced to abdicate. The leaders of this new Continental Army, they don't put him to death. They sentence him to banishment, and they put him on the little island of Elba, which is it's somewhat close to where he actually grew up in Corsica. It's a very small island. It has a little fortress there, and he's put there supposedly to live out the rest of his life. But he has so many loyal followers that within a year, he's able to escape, and he amasses another army. This guy is incredible. So he marches towards Paris, and in the meantime, all the different monarchies of Europe had been reinstated. They had also reinstated one of Louis XVI's brothers onto the throne. His name was Charles. He was actually deeply unpopular with the French population. But when they hear that Napoleon is marching towards Paris, all of the people eagerly join Napoleon. And of course, when Charles hears that Napoleon is coming and the people support Napoleon, he books it. He legs it out of town, and Napoleon marches into Paris, and it's like this grand celebration. And he's able to amass another army. And there is a final battle. He loses. Again, he's captured, and this time he is put on a very distant island in the middle of the Atlantic called St. Helena. He is there for about 5 years, at which point he dies of stomach cancer, which is an excruciating way to die. Throughout this experience, the leaders of Europe they've learned a few lessons. Number one, they never want to allow the population to gain control of anything. They're very, very afraid of nationalism and of popular sovereignty. They want to reinstate the old way. So all of the old monarchies are reinstated on their thrones around Europe. They gather together in Vienna, Austria, hosted by the Habsburg family. They spend about 8 months partying, but also setting up a system that would hold Europe together for about 100 years. So the Congress of Vienna was somewhat successful because it did create a stable government which lasted for 100 years, but it also put the lid on any kind of nationalism or popular sovereignty. And instead, it tried to hold on to the old monarchy style of government, the system that was created.